Good afternoon, and thank you all so much for joining us on the introductory session to using evidence to ensure a whole provider approach in your access and participation plan. It's really exciting to see the numbers still going up. So we've got in excess of 100 people joining us today from across the UK and even beyond. So I just want to briefly introduce some of the key people who'll be leading this work over the next few months, and just to say something about the people that are here today. But there is such a lot that we need to cover that there's not a huge amount of time today, but hopefully we'll be able to work together over the next few months, and much more of this will become unpacked. So I'm very grateful to colleagues Michael Hill, Sally Kift, and Andrew Rawson, who are going to be co-convening this work with me over the next few months. And Michael's not able to join us today as he's got a prior engagement, and Sally is in Australia and so is probably in bed at this time. I'm very grateful, that Andrew is here, and we'll hear from Andrew a little bit later on in this presentation, in this webinar. You're not able to speak, as you can probably see, but we very much encourage you to share any questions through the Q&A function, and Gul will be picking up those questions. So if there's a kind of a point of clarification, then she will interrupt, and I will try to do my best to answer that. We may have time at the end of the session for questions, but I'm doubtful that we'll actually be able to do that. So rather, we will then respond to all the questions in a Q&A sort of document that we'll share with people following this webinar. It is really exciting that we had more than 190 registrations to join in today, and I think when I started this, I had 25 spaces available, so it shows that it's really kind of touched an interest and perhaps a concern that colleagues across the sector have. And we've had all types of institutions who participated, and people from a whole range of roles within the institutions. Interestingly to me, there were people from both Wave 1 and Wave 2 who got in touch and talked about their experiences or wanted to participate in the programme, and also from outside of England. And so we have a really mixed kind of group here today, and hopefully you'll all find something useful. So what I want to do after these kind of introductions is to provide an overview or about what the support program is trying to do and what it will do. And then I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this whole provider approach, which is a sort of term that's emerged in our lexicon and perhaps needs a little bit of unpacking, and use some of the evidence from the Wave 1 institutions, who will, Jill and Richard will share their experiences, and also some analysis that I did of the published APPs, which are currently available, to talk about that, and really use that to build on the research from 2017 to create a revised whole provider approach model. And then I'm hoping that you'll be interested in sharing your own challenges and concerns about taking a whole provider approach. And so there's a Padlet, and encouraging you to share your sort of thoughts through that. And then the final part of the presentation will provide you with details of the programme of support that the University of York is offering. I know that some people have been in touch and said that you have to leave during the course of the session, and that's absolutely fine. But thank you so much for getting in touch and letting me know that that's what's happening. So Mike suggested it would be really helpful to say what you might get out of being here today. And I was very conscious that we needed to make it a useful session for you. So we're going to be sharing lessons from Wave 1 based on analysis of the published access and participation plans, and reflections from two universities, from the University of Leeds and Staffordshire University. And I'm very grateful to Jill Hanson and Richard Kemp for giving up their time today. I'm going to share with you the emerging updated model of a whole provider approach, which I hope might help you to write your section in your access participation plan, even if you don't go any further in terms of working with us. And also, I think it's really important not just to be focusing on writing your APP, but thinking about how we develop our work as a whole provider and to improve participation and equity beyond just writing the APP. And finally, this idea that actually we want to think about how whole provider approach really sits within the development of the whole sector, and to recognise that not all higher education providers are in the same place. And so to give you a little bit of context, and so we'll provide a very brief, very, very brief kind of overview of the context and history of how we've got here today. So the purpose of the programme really, it very much is about working with you. So I would see this as a collaboration and helping to use research evidence and evaluation to ensure that you have a whole provider approach, and that this is also about enhancement. So we're very conscious that institutions are at different places. Some small providers perhaps have done less explicitly about a whole provider approach, and other institutions have perhaps been doing this for many years. But I think underpinning this is a sense that everybody can move and enhance beyond the current position that they're in. And I wanted to stress that it very much builds on previous research about institutional responses to diversity, about how we improve student success, and connecting that to inclusive learning and curriculum reform. And also to previous research that kind of made us realize that you couldn't make changes at perhaps the local level or in the curriculum or in the classroom without changes in a kind of to the institutional context, which were either enabling or in many cases were actually making it quite difficult to bring about the kinds of changes that you were looking for. And also the research on the whole provider approach and institutional change more generally. We are also, it really became clear to me as I started revisiting the research from 2017 about how much the sector has changed and moved in the last 5 or 6 years. And so we need to acknowledge that as well. We're also going to draw on evaluation and theory of change expertise, the expertise of international and UK sector colleagues. In preparing for this programme, I had a really good conversation with Professor Sally Kift, who's done the work on the transition pedagogy and really helped to provide a new way of thinking about this work. And she'll be sharing her expertise in the first of the workshops that we'll be offering. And we've also got good experience of running change programs across the HE sector. I wanted to stress, and I've tried to kind of put this out in some of the communications over the last few days and weeks, that this is about institutional teams. We would like you to work together with colleagues in your institution, and it's for teams that want to review, develop, and evaluate your whole provider approach, and of course, enhance it moving forward. So what the programme of support will offer is basically 3 online workshops, which will be on the 31st of January, the 13th of February, and the 1st of March. And we'll also have an optional workshop on the 18th of March. And we'll just ask for at least one person to attend each of those sessions. Then there'll be some team activities based on some resources to take place between the workshops. And then we'll also be sharing resources from the UK and internationally. We're going to be offering some weekly online drop-in sessions, or a weekly online drop-in session, and then we'll be using all of that to contribute to creating a a whole provider approach implementation and evaluation toolkit. And then we'll culminate the work in June or July with an in-person launch event. And so what we hope is that there'll be ongoing evaluation, dissemination, and learning in this kind of programme of support. So in terms of the outcomes of the programme, I think that there'll be a much more in-depth understanding of the concept of a whole provider approach and what it means in practice. And I have a kind of an aspiration that we look forward and think about how it might look in the future as well. So we're moving beyond the current approach, sort of using an appreciative inquiry approach. And so you'll be able to assess your own institutional strengths, gaps, and priorities, and then create your sort of plans for the future, or for your APP and the future more generally. There'll be this process of sharing, and the focus will also be on implementing, developing, evaluating, and enhancing your whole provider approach. And we'll also have this kind of community of practice where we can work together. And we'll be able to provide you with templates and tools to support the writing of your your whole provider approach, section of the APP, and also your ongoing evaluation and enhancement of your whole provider approach. So thinking about this has been a long journey. And Andrew, perhaps you'd like to say a few words, because you and I have been working in the sector for some time now through many of these journeys that have led us to this place of all institutions across England looking at a whole provider approach.
Thanks, Liz. Yes, we have. I'm Andrew Roseman from Action on Access, and Action on Access has been working with lots of different people, but certainly with Liz and Mike Hale for a long period. If we go back to 1997, I'm not proposing really to go through the slide, you can see it all there. But if I go back to 1997, we were talking about widening participation, perhaps now access and participation. And really that meant essentially outreach and access. And it's really been fascinating in terms of a journey to watch the development from a siloed activity of WP to a much more comprehensive and integrated set of policies and practice. And working, I suppose, increasingly towards this idea of a whole institutional approach, and increasingly critically with proper and developed evaluation. The ecology of the landscape in terms of context is, I think, extraordinarily rich and varied. I've just written myself a list. There's the APPs, which are the main focus of this programme, but there's varied student services, student support, academic skills, personal and academic tutors. There is a school and college liaison through HELOA. There's WP research going on through Narupi. Within institutions, there's lots of bespoke support, so care leavers, neurologically diverse students, those with disabilities, minoritized students. There are charters and quality marks, the NECL one, the Race Equality one, Athena Swan. There are STEM programs, and there are a number of external players, UniConnect, so semi-external, and supporting players like HEAT, NEON, TASO, Unite, Inter-University, and many more. So the ecology is complex, I think, and APPs incorporate, link, and complement various strands of that ecology. The programme that we're outlining today, the whole provider approach, seeks to provide using research evidence, and that obviously is critical to the whole thing, an inclusive approach to students wherever they sit in the institution, largely through developing and importantly evaluating APPs and this particular section of the APPs, whilst recognising the wider ecology. So just briefly to finish, to reiterate, it offers a programme really of using shared experience and collaborative working to develop and complete an evaluation plan for your APP. And this is something which, again, Liz and I and Mike have worked on in various different ways and strands over the last few years. And so it will, as well as that, it will develop a wider understanding, I think, of context. I've given you a much wider context, but quite a bit of that focusing on the APP. And I think usefully at the end of the day, we're looking to produce a toolkit.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew. And we will spend a little bit more looking at that context in the first of those workshops, as I think it's quite important to understand how we've moved to this place and to recognise that not every institution is in exactly the same place. And so one of the things which is you can see here is the whole provider approach maturity model, which was developed as part of the 2017 research. And I think the sector as a whole movement kind of reflects the institutional movements to some extent. So we started off where within institutions, certainly when I started, there were individual champions if you were lucky. And there was kind of project work which was primarily focused on bringing in a more diverse student population. And then we started to see that work progress, and much more recognition that success in higher education was important, and that then we started to see pockets of excellence where some teams were working really well across the whole student life cycle and trying to connect together the student experience in a more coherent way. But often that was in isolation and sometimes in conflict or tension rather with other parts of the institution. And the third generation here is kind of labeled as an inclusive institution where we're working across the life cycle, but also across the whole student experience. And that was a really important thing that came out of the work that we did in 2017. But it wasn't just about the academic experience, it was about the whole student experience, and it was about involving all staff, and it was promoting a consistent approach. But I imagine that towards the end of this program, we can start to conceptualize what the fourth generation looks like in the whole provider maturity model. So that's one of the things that I think that we can look at. But I think the whole provider approach really requires alignment. And Peter Felton's work was really important in helping me to understand what that means, that we need to make sure that the different parts of the institution are pulling in the same direction rather than perhaps in tension with each other. And what we're aiming to do is have more consistency across the institution, which allows us to create our inclusive approach, and that all students benefit irrespective of where they're located in an institution. And that for me is a really important part of it. It's not just luck where they land in the institution about how supported and how successful students from diverse backgrounds are, that all students are enabled to maximize their success irrespective of which part of the institution they engage with and become a part of. And it's also about across their whole student experience, that some of the work shifted our emphasis to looking at the academic experience, which is absolutely crucial to students, particularly students who might fall into the widening participation target groups. But actually, it's also about their whole lived experiences, about things like their commuting experience, as well as their academic learning, and how those things intersect together. And also it's about things like personal development and social engagement rather than just their academic learning. And I would argue they're absolutely integral, but sometimes we've perhaps focused on parts of the experience at the exclusion of others. And so this kind of model about vertical and horizontal alignment builds on the work of Peter Felton. And I think we were understanding that there's a focus on access and success and progression, but we'd perhaps focused on the academic experience, and some of these aspects were still quite separate. So one of the things which was quite interesting when I looked at this in 2017 was around the role that financial support was playing. And you'll recall that there has been quite a lot of questioning about the value of financial support and the role that it plays in widening access and student success. But it was quite often positioned as something on the side, and it wasn't, for example, being connected explicitly into helping students to have a positive academic experience, helping them to be socially engaged, to have good personal and mental health well-being. And it wasn't contributing perhaps explicitly to things like professional development and creating those opportunities and experiences which contribute to progression into graduate employment. So there are lots of ways that we can have much stronger alignment and integration of the student experience. So why do we need to have this whole provider approach? And I think this connects back to some of the work that Andrew, Mike, and I were involved in around perhaps understanding what works in general, but also the What Works program, where we looked at student retention and success. And we started to see the changes that needed to be in place. And we worked with institutional teams across a number of institutions. And quite often these kind of stumbling blocks or challenges were experienced that the institution didn't allow teams and courses to work in ways which would engage students in the way that they wanted to. And so we understood at that point, at the end of 2017 work, that we needed to have this enabling institutional context. And so this very much fed into the work which the Office for Fair Access commissioned in 2017 about a whole institutional approach to widening participation. And it's only when you know what works and you have this enabling context that you're able to roll out your interventions across the whole of the institution, and that this in turn creates greater consistency of the student experience. And arguably this leads to equity of experience and equity of student outcomes, which is of course what much of the work we do is oriented towards. So moving on. The 2017 research then was very much looking at how we implement a whole institution or whole provider approach. And what came through the case study research was that an institutional commitment to widening access and student success was of absolute paramount importance, and that needed to actually be lived rather than just perhaps it's something that was said occasionally. It needed to be really felt and understood by staff and students across the institution. But but what we started to see in this work and other work which I was involved in at the Higher Education Academy was the importance of, on the one hand, the institutional structures, and on the other hand, the institutional culture. And by what I mean structures is the policies and processes and organization of the institution, including the finance and the staffing and those kind of things which enable widening participation and student success to take place. But then it also had to be reflected in the values, attitudes, and practices of staff and students in the institution. And the case studies were very passionate about the values that underpinned the work that they were doing, and that these were embraced by staff across their institutions, which made them different perhaps to other institutions. And so this kind of informs some of the work that is borrowed from Sally Kift around the top-down and bottom-up approach, that you have to have things in place at the top, but you also have to support colleagues and students to hold the values, attitudes, and practices that support widening participation and student success. But all of that needs to be underpinned by data, evidence, and research. And what also became really obvious was that there needed to be a coordinated approach that was allowing things to become more consistent and managed across the institution. So there's a tendency when there's too much kind of bottom-up activity for things to become quite fragmented. So this was really the kind of model that emerged this is the model that emerged in the research in 2017, and really trying to unpack and understand how this might be put into place. But I think in 2023 and 2024, we're in a somewhat different place, as the sector has made large strides really in progress towards requiring institutions, and this has had quite a significant impact. And so I want to think a little bit around, what does a whole provider approach mean in 2023 and 2024, not 34, although that might be interesting. And so I'd like to look at some of the experiences of Wave 1 participants, and also the analysis of the APPs. When I started talking to you about this whole idea about using evidence to create a whole provider approach, lots of colleagues and friends from Wave 1 institutions volunteered to share their experiences. And I'm really grateful today that Richard Kemp, University of Leeds, and Jill Hanson from Stafford University are going to share their experiences. I'm afraid I've only given them about 3 or 4 minutes to speak, but Richard, would you like to share a little bit about the work that you've been doing at Leeds?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Liz, and good afternoon, everybody. So, as Liz had said, we were part of the Wave 1 institutions for this cycle of the Access and Participation Plan. And obviously we had to complete the whole provider approach as part of that process. Just to briefly, most of you, I guess, will be familiar with the University of Leeds to some extent, but we are a large institution, large Russell Group institution. So obviously we write our whole provider approach within that context. And I think it's also fair to say that we didn't get any specific feedback on this from the Office for Students when we submitted it. Obviously the APP was approved, but we didn't have anything specifically about the whole provider approach. But hopefully we could take the fact that the whole document was approved as some kind of endorsement that the whole provider approach made some kind of sense. I think some of the key themes of our whole provider approach specifically is that it was quite comprehensive. So we tried to look at the institution as a whole, the relevant strategies that link to the Access and Participation Plan, and make sure that we're talking about them. We did make reference to establishing access to student success culture within the institution, which was also mentioned in other parts of the Access and Participation Plan that was part of the whole provider approach as well. And we also made reference to curriculum and the importance of establishing access and student success principles within the curriculum, as well as other parts of the institution. So the kind of approach that we took is that we highlighted institutional strategies particularly the Access and Student Success Strategy, which is our overarching widening participation strategy for the University of Leeds. So the whole provider approach gave us an opportunity to talk about that a little bit more. And then we brought in some of the broader university strategies that link very closely. So the Equality, Diversity, Inclusion, EDI strategy, and also our Student Opportunities and Future strategy as well. I think the EDI strategy is obviously quite clear in terms of how that links to Access and Participation Plan. With the Student Opportunities and Future strategy, that allowed us to talk a little bit more about themes such as student employability, so that full kind of student life cycle approach. We didn't set any targets to do with progression because it wasn't where our biggest gaps are, but the whole provider approach did give us an opportunity to talk about student employability and the overarching strategies in a little bit more detail. And I think that's something to bear in mind with the whole provider approach. It does give you an opportunity talk a little bit more broadly, whereas when you have your intervention strategies, they have to link quite closely to your objectives. And I think that's an important thing to note from experience, certainly in how we approached it anyway. I think the other key themes it allowed us to talk more fully about student life cycles, so the progression that I've already mentioned, but also some of the work we do in postgraduate research, which isn't directly relevant to the APP, but it means we could talk whole provider approach. We felt that was relevant. The curriculum I've already mentioned, and the students being at the heart of the curriculum, but also the planning exercises within the institution, and particularly within university faculties, that the fact that the whole provider approach allowed us to talk about how faculties need to have access and student success principles when they're doing their planning exercises as well. I'm not sure how much time I've taken this, but I'll go on to kind of the tips for Wave 2 providers. I think from experience, the kind of key tips that we would have would be that understand the university strategy and where access and student success fits within those broader strategies, because I think the Office of Students will expect you to talk about that. As I say, the access and student success strategy at the University of Leeds was the critical one. But I think understanding it more broadly within university strategies is really important. I think involving senior management at your institutions as soon as possible is really important, so they can have a view of what you plan to write, how you're linking strategies and all those kind of things. We found that really valuable as well. Bring a student voice as soon as possible as well. And I think another theme that we wanted in this whole provider approach was to highlight that the institution as a whole is accountable for access and student success, and not just the WP department. And that was a really critical thing that underpinned the document, but particularly the whole provider approach section of the document as well. I think that accountability and demonstrating accountability is really important. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Richard. And I think that's a really useful, but also a really nice connection into the work that Staffordshire have been doing around their whole provider approach. Jill, can I ask you to come in now?
Thanks, Liz. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'll talk briefly about Staffordshire University. It's not very much like Leeds at all. It's quite small in comparison. It's a post-92, and the majority of our students tick at least one box in terms of widening access and participation. So our cohort of students is unique. In terms of the actual work that we did, this was led by my colleague, Vanessa Dodd. She's head of education research and evaluation. So it was her team that oversaw the majority of the work for the APP submission. And very briefly, Vanessa's team, along with some other colleagues to myself, people from our Staffordshire Centre of Learning and Pedagogic Practice, and some other experts from transition and access teams, worked together to look at the dashboard data, identify our key risks, and then identify 5 strands of work which would mitigate those risks. So each of those strands was designated a lead, and within that strand there were a variety of different programmes. Some of those programmes were targeted at particular groups of students, and some of those programmes were embedded so that any student would be benefiting from them. So if I think about the key features of our Staffordshire APP, we focused on the student journey. So our strands are focusing on access. We had some key risks identified in terms of different groups of students that we needed to increase access for. Our second strand was transition. So we have a big focus on ensuring that the students, that when they do make the decision to come here, that they are fully supported to make that transition. And for a lot of them, it's a really difficult transition. So that was a key risk. Our third strand was looking at teaching and learning and the curriculum. So ensuring that that was inclusive in lots of different ways, not just in terms of the actual teaching and learning itself and those materials and behaviour in classrooms, but making sure that it was inclusive in terms of employability development and those other aspects that you need to build in to ensure that all of your students are able to access the kinds of learning that allows them to progress further on. We had a big element looking at student support and learner analytics. And then a final element is thinking about progression, so employability and career development. So each of those strands had a lead. The lead was responsible for developing the theory of change for the strand and then working with programme managers, if you like, to identify theory of changes for each of the individual programmes. So everything was theory of change to death. And within those theory of changes, we also had quite a strong evaluation element, and that was embedded as much as we could into the actual programmes itself. Someone in Vanessa's team plan did an excellent job of setting out an evaluation strategy for the whole APP. And then we were able to, each strand lead was able to take that overall approach and mimic it for our individual strand and set out what we would do, what kind of evaluation activities we were thinking about. And we use different criteria like the importance of the intervention, practicalities of being able to evaluate it at different levels, how we would collect the data, all that kind of stuff. And that would allowed us to identify how we would evaluate it and the kind of evaluation that we would have to do. As a backdrop to that, to be able to do this, we have spent the last 18 months working with professional services, deans, associate deans, head of departments and course leaders to build a theory of change mindset with them. So we've done quite a lot of work in delivering the Change Busters game, which is really an effective way, particularly with professional services, of helping them understand theory of change, but also doing one-on-one workshops and ensuring that each school and then each department and then each course, if they wished, had their theory of change, which was mapped against APP targets and risks. So we've started this with a backdrop of a quite good progress in terms of staff understanding the importance of a theory of change, how to use that, and then bringing that forward and using it to monitor progress. In terms of challenges, I think Vanessa's team would tell you that it's capacity, because it's a huge amount of work to take on, and a lot of it was unknown. We don't, you quite often don't know what is it the OFS are going to ask for. We can submit something that we think is brilliant and they'll turn around and go, no, this is rubbish. Happily that did not happen. Like Richard's team, ours was sent back with minimal corrections, just where we kind of made mistakes and they needed a bit more information. Some of the other challenges were academic staff buy-in to theory of change. That might be more about how we delivered that learning rather than the learning itself. Academic staff capacity to engage with the process, evaluation expert capacity as well within your organisation has to be, as much as you can empower individuals to embed evaluation into their programmes, at some point you do need expertise in designing that and perhaps in looking at the data, analysing the data and finding those reports and disseminating those in a what works style. And I think most importantly is governance of progress. If you're going to set up these theory of changes and have those plans in place, you need to make sure that there's governance and accountability, where if we divert from those plans and things aren't happening. So hopefully that makes some sort of sense.
Thank you so much. And I think what everyone can probably see is that there are similarities and differences between the approaches that the institutions have taken. And I think it's important to remember that some of the things which both Richard and Jill have talked about are things that you can commit to do as part of your APP work. You don't have to have done it all by the submission date, because I know that that's seeming really quite close for many of us, kind of living and breathing it at the moment. So if that feels overwhelming, I hope you wouldn't take that away from it, but rather that these are some of the opportunities and ways that you might start to see how your work develops, but also that there doesn't seem to be a highly prescriptive approach in terms of what you need to be including in that section, but actually it gives us lots of opportunity to think about how we develop our institutions and learn together to start to do more. Do please feel free to ask questions. I think that Jill and Richard and all of us would be happy to answer those either during the session or afterwards. And I know that people have really valued hearing from colleagues in all sorts of settings in the last few months. So thank you so much, Jill and Richard. I think that was really helpful and really complementary approaches to what you've both been doing. But they both sound fantastic, and yeah, I really wouldn't want anyone to feel like, oh my goodness, I can't do that, because I think that's partly why we want to work together, and that you can plan those things as part of your APP rather than do everything now. I thought it might just be interesting as well to look a little bit at what I saw. So I read over the Christmas. I don't actually have a life. I've also got some sunshine here, which I'm not complaining about. Over Christmas, I did read all of the APPs, and it was interesting to see what other institutions were doing beyond Staffordshire and Leeds. And I think what comes through quite strongly in that section is that there's a huge diversity around what people have included in that section on their access and participation plans. As Richard mentioned, there's a lot of mention or discussion of EDI policies, so equality, diversity, and inclusion, and how that aligns with your whole institution approach. And that's not really surprising, as that's very much one of the things which comes through in the OFS's guidance. There's also quite a lot of description around the organisational side of APP, where it sits in the institution, the committee structure, and the governance of APP, and that's quite interesting. I think that perhaps describes less around how it's coordinated and more about how it's managed if across the institution. There are quite a few institutions that talk about the kind of cross-institutional interventions, the sort of things which both Richard and Jill talked about there. There's less discussion around evaluation in the way that Jill described, but there's more there is an emphasis on evidence, and also around the use of data dashboards and how those are kind of embedded across the institution for different groups and staff and committees to draw upon. And there's some, but perhaps not that much, on sort of institutional culture, by which I mean things like helping all staff to understand what's involved. And I think a number of institutions are talking about, or have done, or will do things like road shows and other things like that to help sort of spread that work across the institution and develop that understanding. And so I think this has similarities with the kind of work, the case study work that I did in 2017, but also shows a kind of a direction. There's movement and change as we see the sector moving towards this kind of moving goal of a whole provider approach. And so I sort of thought it was quite useful to reframe this in a slightly different model. So I think what we've got then very much at the heart of our whole provider approach is the student experience, that integrated experience across the student life cycle. So combining the academic experience, the personal well-being, professional development, social engagement, and sort of something that contributes to students' belonging and thriving, irrespective of their background and things like that. And I still think that it's really important that institutional commitment is in there in the senior management and leadership. And then we start to see that that's underpinned by data and evaluation, and that's used in different ways across different institutions. And then you've got the alignment of policies and processes and practices described by the structure on the left, and then the culture, the values, and the practices of staff on the right-hand side. And I think what we'll do in the whole provider approach support program is really unpack those things and think about what that looks like and how those things work together to actually move the whole institution forward. So that's my kind of first stab at a new model, which perhaps helps you to think a little bit about your whole provider approach and the sorts of things that you might want to include in there. have done quite a full analysis of the whole provider approach sections of the APPs, and so I'll be kind of sharing more of that in due course. But in the meantime, I think it would be really good if you would like to share some of your own challenges and concerns you have for kind of creating your APP if you're a Wave 2 institution, or indeed if you're a Wave 1 institution, the kind of concerns you see yourself having moving forward. So there's a Padlet, and if you use the QR code, which is on the screen now, or I think Gull is going to put the web link into the chat as well. I can't see everything on this screen. Then you can add your thoughts into that around the kind of things that are concerning you at the moment. So I've asked in the Padlet about how would you describe your current widening whole provider approach? What are your concerns about writing a whole provider approach in your APP? What are your concerns about a whole provider approach more generally? And what would you like from the support program? That is probably a lot more than we've got time to get through now. And we'll leave that open so you can carry on adding into it after the webinar. So the program of support. What we're proposing is a series of workshops. So originally one of these was going to be in person, but I spoke to my very helpful colleagues at the University of York who impressed upon me the urgency of time. And so, in terms of both having to push the program slightly earlier than I'd originally been thinking, and also about how much time colleagues are investing in writing their APPs. So we've put all of the workshops online. They're each going to be for 2 hours, and they're timed at lunchtime. So hopefully people will have that sort of chance to sort of participate. There's not an ideal time, but hopefully that's the middle of the day, which at least means people who haven't got sort of other responsibilities, who have got other responsibilities can attend. And so they will all be online. They'll all be 2 hours, and they'll all be 12:30 to 2:30. And so the first one is going to be very much thinking more about understanding a whole provider approach, the different approaches and models, and the kinds of things that we've started talking about today, how institutions are doing it. And then the activity will be around undertaking a self-assessment around sort of gauging strengths and weaknesses and identifying gaps and priorities for your whole provider approach. And some institutions may think there are millions of things they can do, but it doesn't have to be everything. It's really about selecting which things need to be the priorities moving forward. And what we're expecting or requesting is that teams sign up to do this rather than individuals, but at least one individual from each team is able to attend each workshop. And then you go away and you meet together at a convenient time to kind of do those activities. So in an ideal world, we'd have much longer, we'd have the dates in advance, everyone would have their diary, that we'd get together. But I think realistically that's going to be really challenging. So workshop 1 is going to have this kind of whole provider approach, understanding, looking at models and those kind of things. And then there'll be a self-assessment tool, which will allow you to think about where you want to position your work in this area moving forward. Workshop 2 is then going to be around sharing your own strengths and looking at what other people have been doing. This is where we'll bring in some of the international work as well and think about identifying and adapting other people's approaches and building them into your own work and using a theory of change to plan those interventions. And so then the team activity between will be about creating an intervention plan using a theory of change template. And then we'll bring all that information together and use that to create a sort of draft theory of change evaluation framework, which we'll then share back with you, which hopefully will then be a useful resource that you can then use in your own work moving forward and will hopefully save you a job to do. And so the third workshop will then focus on developing your own evaluation plans, looking at indicators and evidence sources, and looking at things like the short-term benefits and the medium-term outcomes. And my own kind of previous experience suggests that those medium-term outcomes are the most difficult ones to kind of decide exactly what they are. And I'm really happy to see Jill nodding there. Thank you. And those are the bits that are the most difficult to get your head around, because there are bits about people doing things differently or organisations doing things differently. So we'll then have that third workshop on the 1st of March. And I hope that gives you then enough time if you've got to get your APP signed off and those sorts of things. And there'll be an activity to create and finish your evaluation plan and share that back with us, hopefully. And then we decided to put in a fourth optional workshop, which is really not part of the things that we'd expect you to sign up to if you want to do this, but around sort of coming back together as a community of practice and sort of carrying on thinking about the challenges and learning together and joint problem solving. And when we've run change programs in the past, that's always been a really useful bit where everyone says, well, people say, I got stuck with this, and then people can either share their own experiences or come up with their own ideas, which are really helpful. Then we also sort of built into this program of support some other activities. So there'll be some ongoing sharing of resources, and I will be in touch with colleagues to encourage you to share things which you've done. So I've already received something this morning from one university about some transition work across the whole institution, and hopefully we can collect more and more of that to start sharing out with you to give you more ideas. We're going to run online drop-in sessions every Monday from the 5th of February, excluding bank holidays, until the end of July, which will give you a chance to come in and say, this is horrible. They're not going to be like, you're not going to get an individual slot, but if you want to come along and share and discuss with each other and just be part of a group and reflect, that would be great. Then we'll take all the learning from this and try and build a toolkit, which is really about sort of thinking about whole provider approach moving beyond this point. So it's not just about completing an APP, it's about actually developing the whole sector and developing whole institutions to improve the success and outcomes of students from targeted groups. And then we'll have a launch event, and I haven't fixed the date for that, but we'll take some sort of advice and guidance from colleagues sometime in June or July. And hopefully we can all meet together in person for that. We've got some funding to have a venue and things like that. So hopefully we can do that as a kind of community of practice. And there will be this then kind of ongoing evaluation and dissemination and sharing of learning. And I think it should very much be around enhancement and that sort of thing. So that's really what's planned at the moment. The next steps, however, are that it is all quite compressed in terms of a timetable. So we will be sharing the slides from this presentation. We'll also share the recording, although that might take a couple more days to come out to you. And we'll be asking for institutions to express an interest in participating in this program and to name a key contact person. And then we are asking for a kind of brief statement of how you'll engage and benefit from the program. And we don't really know how many teams will want to participate, and we're going to try and accommodate as many as possible, but we may need to sort of select. So we're asking for a very brief statement, and we'll provide some guidance on that in the expression of interest form. And then we're also asking you to agree to our expectations. So these are hopefully very modest and not particularly problematic, but we'd like at least one person to be able to attend each of the workshops from the institutional team. You're welcome for more people to attend, but I think at least one would be necessary to make it work. And then to undertake the activities between the workshops, so to meet together as a team, and then share the details of the work that you've been doing with us at the University of York, and also to share with us your evaluation, to evaluate the program. So when we ask for some feedback on how good it was, how useful it was, what else could be better, that you'll do that. And then to share your access participation plan with us and to share any kind of evaluation outcomes or learning on an ongoing process throughout your APP. And we're also asking people to nominate examples of practice which relate to whole provider approach, which can be shared with the wider sector. If you've got things you want to share which you don't want to be shared more widely, then that's fine, but you just need to let us know so we don't inadvertently share it with the whole sector. If there's anything in this presentation that you would like to cite, then you'll be able to access the presentation and we'll also send it to you. And it would be great if you could cite it in the way that's kind of listed there. And there's also a list of kind of references of stuff which I've been involved in and to do with the whole provider approach, and then a list of references around evaluation as well. So thank you all very much for joining today. And we will be in touch and asking if you are interested in kind of joining with us on this kind of community of practice around a whole provider approach. But thank you so much to everybody for giving up your time today.